joining this event, the Complete Removable Insulation Blanket Bootcamp for Engineers. So today we will be discussing the overview of the changes in the industry, what's available in the industry. And here to present for us is Brett from Furwin. So some of you may or may not be familiar with Furwin or Brett and their operations, but through this presentation today, you guys will have an idea of a lot more, a better understanding of the industry and what's available for you moving forward in 2022. So without further ado, I'm going to let Brett take the floor here, and we can get started with the presentation. Brett, go ahead.
Okay, well, great. Thanks, Derek. Thank you for that. Thank you for getting everything organized. And welcome to all our attendees. We really appreciate you taking the time to educate yourselves in this area. It's not the most glamorous product in the world, insulation. It's the kind of thing that people don't really see. It's best out of sight doing its job, but it's critical. All those who need it understand how important it is on many different levels, and some of those we will touch on during the presentation. So in today's presentation, we would like to give a general overview of insulation blankets. We're not going to get too much into the technical details. We'd like you to just have a good overall understanding. In the introduction, we will basically be discussing what is an insulation blanket, what is it made from, how's it constructed, just so you have a basic understanding. And some of you may have this knowledge, and I apologize if it's going to be repetitive. It's difficult to aim it at everyone, but we will go through that fairly quickly just so you understand what is an insulation blanket, what's it made out of, and some of the points to consider in an insulation blanket. We will then also, we'll move on to benefits of removable covers. In that section, we'll touch on some of the applications of insulation blankets, what is different about insulation blankets as opposed to other types of insulation, and that should give you a good oversight over there. The next two sections, we'll start focusing on what's required to make sure that the insulation blanket that you order will meet your specifications, how to order an insulation blanket, what type of information the provider will be looking for to make sure that it does what it's needed to do. And that's what that will be that section, and then we'll wrap it up. Hopefully by time we leave the seminar today, you'll have a good understanding what an insulation blanket is, some of the variety that's available in insulation blankets, when to use an insulation blanket, and the type of information that the provider will be looking for to make sure that they can meet your requirements. So without further ado, let's move on to the exciting world of insulation blankets. Okay, let's get started. What is an insulation blanket? So there's all kinds of variety. We're going to focus on what's most common in an insulation blanket, and I'd like to zoom into this visual over here, which kind of gives a good overview of what goes into an insulation blanket. We have the outer protective cover. That's this gray section on the outside in this photo. We have the insulation material, the actual insulation. Then we have what we call the inner liner, which is kind of what holds the blanket together. Let's just start briefly with discussing the outer protective cover. So there's different terminologies used for these things. It's also known as the cold surface of the blanket. That's typically the surface that's furthest away from the heat source, or sometimes could be the cold source. but this is the outside of the blanket. The main purpose is designed to shield and protect the insulation. So therefore, the main purpose of this area over here is to protect the insulation blanket. Some things to take into consideration when choosing or asking for the outer protective cover is, first of all, what kind of heat exposure it's going to be exposed to. Either you're going to have heat coming from the outside, or there's going to be heat that's going to be conducted through the insulation to your outer surface. And it's important that that material, as in every component of the insulation blanket, is going to be suitable for the heat that is going to be exposed to. Other things to take into account: what type of environment is it going into? Is it going to be wet? Does it need to be able to handle wetness, different chemicals, different fluids? Is it going into a dusty environment where it can become dirtied and has to be cleaned off easily? How much abrasion is it going to be exposed to? How tough and rugged does it need to be? These are all important questions. And even though one doesn't think of insulation this way, but does it have to be aesthetically pleasing? Do we want it to look good? Is it going into an environment where it's a high-end vehicle? It has to look good. So these are all the type of questions that we would want to know when selecting this layer of the blanket to make it do its job as best as possible. Then we move into the main part of an insulation blanket, which is the name insulation. So that is the insulation. The insulation can be different thicknesses. Typically in an insulation blanket, we wouldn't go thicker than 4 inches, even that's pushing it, only because it becomes impractical. Again, an insulation blanket, like we'll discuss, is something which is going to be taken on and off and moved around. If it becomes too thick and heavy, it becomes somewhat clunky and impractical. Not to say that we can't, sometimes we'll use 2 layers of insulation blanket if we need to get it thick enough. So we'd actually have maybe a 4-inch layer and then another 4-inch layer. So there's really no limit, but any individual blanket typically, and again, there's always the exception, but typically would not be, is more commonly 1 or 2 inch, but could be up to 4 inch and could be as thin as an 1/8 or even, a 1/2 inch. What do we need to consider for the insulation? Well, we have to consider the temperature. It has to be rated for the exposure temperature. We have to consider how much insulation value we need to provide. So that will affect the thickness or the type of insulation. Some insulations are better insulators than others. So when we need to do an extreme reduction of heat loss, obviously we have to look at that differently than if we're going to, if it's not such intense extreme heat, we have to choose the correct insulation for that. Another consideration is, are there going to be fluids in the environment which could be absorbed into the insulation? Some insulations tend to wick or absorb fluids more than others. So these are all the different types of considerations to take into account. Also, how rugged does insulation have to be? Typically in an insulation blanket, we're going to use more dense type insulations because as they moved around and installed and taken off, some of the lighter weight, less dense insulations can compress, thereby compromising on the quality of the insulation that it's going to provide. These are all the different types of considerations we need to take into account when choosing insulation. That brings us to the inside of the blanket, what we call the inner layer of the blanket. This is, or the hot surface. In a hot application, that will be the surface going against the hot surface. In some ways, this is the layer that really makes it an insulation blanket as opposed to a different type of insulation like a permanent cladding insulation, because this is what makes it into a bag or into a bundle, which allows one to move your insulation around, take it off to put it on without it falling apart. So that's the layer that pulls it all together. It's a very important layer because this is being exposed directly to the application, whether it's very high temperatures or very cold temperatures. So certainly that's a critical consideration, is to specify a material that's suitable for the temperature being used. In this picture, it's a stainless steel mesh, which is a great liner for high temperature applications. And it's also very flexible, which makes the blanket practical and flexible. And it's fairly economical. Some other materials will become more expensive, but these are all. So what do we want to consider? Obviously, the temperature rating. Do we need to seal in the insulation? Can this be a permeable surface, or does it need to be a fluid, waterproof surface? Does it, how sensitive is the environment? Typically, if we're using high temperature insulations, they're going to be fibrous, fiberglass, ceramics. And these fibers can get into the environment. Some environments are going to be more sensitive. If it's a clean room environment, that's a no-no. We don't want those fibers getting out. So we need to come up with a liner that's going to contain them. A stainless steel mesh, like shown in this photograph, will not be suitable for that. Some environments are wet, so we need to kind of seal in the environment. These are some of the considerations. How is the blanket kept together? There's two main methods used in the industry. Some of the more lower tech providers are using what's known as a hog ring. It's something like a staple, a metal staple, that they would staple these layers together. It's a good method for sometimes if you have to do repairs on site or quickly assemble a blanket on site. You don't need sewing equipment or anything. You just need the tool to install the hog rings. At Fairwin, our preferred method is to use a sewn thread. So it's sewn together. It's tends to be a cleaner, neater finish. It also doesn't catch the fingers like sometimes hog rings can hurt the fingers. And it looks better. Each one has its advantages. So that's typically how the blanket's going to be assembled. And that comes to the last part of the blanket, which is our fastening systems. At the end of the day, the blanket has to be attached to the equipment. So we need some kind of fastening system. Many systems are out there, and Fairwin does offer many different systems. Here are some examples. The most common is what's known as lacing wire and rivets or hooks. Essentially, it's kind of like a hiking boot. You just take a stainless steel wire and you wrap it up. We have straps, snaps like on a winter coat, springs, which is a quick fastening system. Springs attached to one side and you hook it over the other side. Velcro can be used. And again, it's important that the fastening system is suitable for the application. Some things to take into account when looking into what fastening system to use. One is economics. There's a very big price difference between a rivet and wire and a strap, just in terms of the material and the labor required to get that on there. What temperature is it exposed to? Velcro, as you know, has very fine hooks, which becomes very heat sensitive. So if it touches a hot surface, there goes your Velcro. You lose your effectiveness of the Velcro. There are higher temperature Velcros. Some of them get very expensive, but that's an important consideration, is the temperature. Something we want to also think about is this insulation blanket going to be removed regularly? If that's the case, you want a system that's easy to take on and put off, like a strap or a snap. You don't need any tools, and it's easy to take on and off. Velcro can also be effective in that kind of an application. Is this a one-off blanket? Is it a custom designed application? if any of you have ever put on weight and tried to close your shirt, you'll know that a shirt, there's only one setting, right? There's no adjustability. So either it fits or it doesn't fit. So sometimes if it's a complex application and it's a one-off, we don't have a chance to fine-tune the fit. You want a system that gives you flexibility, like a strap that can be adjusted, or the wire is great for that. You can loosen it, you can attach it in different ways. That gives you a lot of flexibility. You don't get stuck like with a snap, for example, or a spring, which is really only good at that set distance. So those are some of the considerations when you're choosing a fastening system. Just to show you some different examples, I'll just put together a slide here that kind of shows different selections. We have over here, we have different materials for the outer choice. The beige material is a very high temperature material. When there's intense heat, the gray material is a silicone coating. That I would say is the real bread and butter of insulation blankets. The most commonly used materials are fiberglass fabric with a silicone coating. That's great up to around 500 F. So that's high temperature, but not the super high temperatures. That's oil proof, has many advantages as well. Some of the higher temperature fabrics are no longer oil proof or fluid proof because of the high temperatures, the coatings get burnt off. This is a lower temperature application. This is just a PVC fabric. It's a cheap, economical fabric. You don't need to have that fiberglass high temperature ratings. It looks good, comes in many colors, is a good option for lower temperature applications. Here we have a picture with a stainless steel foil liner. That's in applications where we need to protect insulation from seepage, from flammable fluids. Very popular in high sensitive areas such as underground mining, where we have to keep any fluids, flammable fluids, out of the insulation. Over here, it's maybe not as clear, but this is something that had to look good. Nice metallic finish, eye-catching, great for special applications where you may have customers who just want to have something that's going to look good, high-tech, look eye-catching. Okay, so that's the introduction. That's just to give a basic idea of what an insulation blanket is, some of the considerations. So we're going to move now to the next section, the where and the why of insulation blankets. What applications are they used in? And the next slide, how's this different than other insulation? So in a nutshell, insulation blankets can be used wherever any other insulation is used. There's nothing that different about an insulation blanket than the most common type of insulation, which is the cladding. At Fairwin, we commonly use it on the full exhaust of engines, including the turbos, the real hot components of the engine. Here we have a picture of the silencer, Y collectors, flex joints, the full system of the exhaust, right from the engine turbo all the way out to the exhaust. That's the high temperature applications. Then we have the lower temperature applications, which would be valves and process temperatures. There, the insulation is used typically to prevent freezing, to maintain production temperatures, optimum temperatures for performance. So there's really no limit. We've used pretty much anywhere where one can dream up where insulation can be used. We've seen that and custom made the product for that application. So what is really unique about an insulation blanket? When would one use an insulation blanket? When would one maybe not use an insulation blanket? Again, the primary alternate to an insulation blanket is what's known in the industry as permanent insulation or cladding insulation. Typically, that would be installed by an insulation contractor who would come to site and install that insulation. So let me briefly go through some of the advantages of each one. So you know when you want to use the insulation blanket, when you want to use cladding. So what are some of the advantages? We'll start with, let's start maybe with the permanent insulation, the cladding. I'm not here to twist everybody's arm to always use the insulation blanket. It's everything has its right time and place. Cladding is useful on the large scale projects where you bring in a whole insulation crew, they'll put it on. You don't need to provide any kind of information. They measure everything on site and put it on site. No manufacturing is required beforehand. It shows up with the raw materials. For large projects, certainly more economical and larger scale. Typically is done with the permanent insulation. Because it's permanent, it doesn't have to be removable. It can be made to be very rugged. So some applications where you have engineers or technicians walking on the pipes or the material, cladding, there's very strong outer cladding that can be used. Also, because it's permanent, it's not being removed, they can put much better seals onto this. So if it's a very sensitive fluid or outdoor rainy kind of environment where they cannot afford for anything to get into the equipment, sometimes a permanent insulation was a good choice because they can seal that on and it's not going to be removed. So when does a blanket become the material of choice, or the insulation of choice? So firstly, they're easily installed. This can be done by anyone. At Furwin, I would say above 95% of our customers put it on themselves. They don't need any kind of expertise or training. It's pretty much turnkey. It comes in the box, and anyone who has some semblance of being handy can do it. So typically any technician on these sites will be more than qualified to put it on. So it's easily installed. You don't need any kind of special training. This is also another good reason that we see sometimes the customers in a remote location to ship out any kind of installers or a technical team to put it on is just prohibitively expensive. Especially if it's a small job, to fly out professional installation contractors can be prohibitive. With the removable blanket, we manufacture it, ship it to site, and any local technician is more than qualified to put it on. So can be a very compelling reason to go with a blanket. It's reusable. So this makes it a great choice where it's going on equipment that you need to take the insulation off from time to time to get in and see what's going on, to make do repairs. So that's and that's really the same as this last point, and that I would say is probably the primary advantage of the insulation blankets is the removability of that. With permanent cladding, even if the initial time putting it on, it's going to be cheaper, possibly, but many times will be cheaper. But once there's repair work that has to be happened, and they have to basically remove that insulation, that insulation for the most part is ruined at that point. New insulation is required, and a new team of insulation contractors will need to come back to reinstall the insulation. At that point, it's not only a major headache and inconvenience, but now the expense starts to go up. I recently spoke to a customer. They're spending tens of thousands of dollars replacing their insulation every month. It's just a type of application where the insulation just gets beat up and damaged, and they are now considering a removable solution, because even though the initial cost may be more expensive, they're going to save literally tens of thousands of dollars in the long run, hopefully. It is turnkey, so it can be designed to accommodate all the which we'll speak about a little bit more soon. But the insulation blanket can be customized so that it's easy, that no cutting back and changing the blanket on site will be required. Sometimes cladding requires a very high skill to shave down the insulation and make it suitable for that application. So those are some of the places where you'd want to use an insulation blanket. Typically where it's because you're going to want to remove it typically, sometimes permanent as well. As an overview on some of the areas of that. Never forget that at the insulation, as we mentioned above, is a critical component. It's important for safety. Here's in the top right, we have an application that was a hot system at ground level. Very dangerous for people passing by. This is an underground truck. Again, underground, they don't have any flexibility when it comes to safety. They cannot afford to take risks. You can see over here, it's a bit difficult, the insulation there. It has to protect the equipment. There, the main concern is fluid leaks and often working in tight environments where there's a high danger to personnel. So it's not always about safety insulation blankets. Often it's about efficiency, heat conservation, but safety is obviously always going to be a very high critical consideration. So that just summarizes the area about insulation blankets, how they're different than other insulations, when they're used, and why use an insulation blanket. I'm going to now move into the next section of the presentation. And that is, how do you communicate with your insulation provider to give them the information that they require? I know at Furwin, we take pride in giving our customers what they need, what they want. But in order to do that, we need to get information from the customer. So we'll just spend a little bit of time focusing on that. How do you contact us or a different provider to get them information? Today, with things have changed a lot in the last 20 years. When I started at Furwin, they were still using the instant cameras, the Polaroids, where they would print pictures and send you a photograph in the mail, fax machine. So a lot's changed, obviously, over the last 20 years in our industry as well as your industries, every industry. Today, the best method of communication to get what you need is CAD drawings. Depending how complex, 3D CAD drawings, 2D if it's a simpler application. That gives us the information we need, especially with 3D. But even with that, photographs, always a good idea. If you have photographs, sometimes we actually do design before the equipment is even made, so we don't have the luxury of photographs. But a photograph, even with CAD drawings, a photograph can tell us a lot of information that even the 3D model won't. Just in terms of environment, we can sometimes pick up things that even the CAD drawing may have missed. So that would be our first recommendation, is if the customer can provide those drawings. Okay, but sometimes they're not available. So what happens in that case? So many customers will just, again, depending on how sophisticated they are, they could just provide a hand sketch. Depending how complex the system is, that could be fine. And it works and it's worked for many years. And sometimes just that's the easy way. Take out a scrap of paper and just jot it down. For customers not confident or they're not equipped or skilled enough to take dimensions and make a sketch, so we help them. Send us a photograph of the application and we'll often provide a sketch. We will take that photograph, interpret it into a CAD drawing, and send it down to the customer. Say, listen, for us to get you what you need, we need these dimensions. And we will give a clear sketch showing exactly what dimensions. And at that point, they can just have, again, a non-skilled person just who's good enough with a tape measure, providing us with that information. That's also a very effective way that we have found working. Obviously, the provider can go on site and take measurements as well. It's a good solution in many cases. The challenge with that is when it's a remote work site, even if it's not that remote, but it would require traveling for us. If it's a small job, that the traveling fees, just paying for the travel and the flights and the hotels, can sometimes be many times more expensive than the actual insulation blankets. So sometimes it's depending on the applications. If it's a very large job, which is going to require hours and hours of measuring, then the best solution then will be for the provider to come on site and do that measuring. Obviously, for local jobs, local to where the provider is, that becomes easier. A lot of traveling involved, you run into expenses like everything else. At Fairwind, we've worked, as shown in this picture, this is a new technology that we've been working with, and that's 3D scanning. So you can see over here, this is a very complex piece of equipment with all kinds of thermocouples and electrical fixtures and all kinds of complexity there. And even if we went to site, it would be hard to really measure this accurately enough to get a good fitting blanket. If the vendor had good 3D models, would have been a good solution. But even a 3D model that won't necessarily have this level of complexity to it, that would be a very expensive 3D model. Sometimes would, sometimes don't. So we work with 3D scanning. That's a new technology that's available to us. We can either come and do the 3D scanning ourselves, or if it's a far removed site, most major cities have services that rent out 3D scanning capabilities. It's pretty cutting edge. A lot of providers will not have the expertise to deal with the 3D information that comes from the scan. We've done some very successful projects using this technology, so that's another method. At the end of the day, I know with Fairwind, if you just can't figure that out, you have a need, you have to insulate it. How do you get an information? There's always the old-fashioned thing that's called the telephone. We've become pretty successful at working with customers to figure out how to get that information when coming to site is not practical. Okay, so what kind of information do we need in terms of detail? So we need to know about not only the component itself, shown here. So the muffler is a relatively simple geometry, but support brackets can get in the way of the insulation. We need to know sometimes a nameplate has to be exposed on a component. Sometimes we need to know thermocouples that have to get exposure. So depending on the application will depend on how much detail we need to know. If it's just heat, let's say a burn protection, so we don't necessarily need to know every detail of the item. We need to know the surface that is exposed where people can touch. That's how much detail we'd need to know. We wouldn't need to know more detail than that in that application, but some applications we would need to know that level of detail. Okay, here's just another slide showing some of the complex piping that we need to accommodate. This is heat tracing on valves out in the outdoors for very cold temperatures. Oh, what's supposed to happen? Sorry. There's ice building up, so I have to protect from ice. That's where the insulation comes in. And in these applications, sometimes it's critical for the process to maintain the heat that it's very thoroughly insulated. So we need to be very particular in how we get in there to make sure that there's no heat or minimal heat escaping, so that the operations and the piping, whatever the chemicals or whatever it is, can function optimally. That's also very important in heat extrusion, plastic extrusion, when they need to maintain constant temperatures in the system to make sure that their extrusions are working well. Another important thing to notify the vendor: what's the environment? Is it outdoor? Is it indoor? Is it a touch-safe critical application? Are you looking to minimize how much heat loss there is, again, to maintain process temperatures? How much heat can you afford to lose? How much heat do you have to contain? That's an application where the provider, especially if they're more technically adept, if they have technical people, engineers and staff, they can help determine how much insulation is required in order to contain enough heat to achieve your goals. This application over here is an SCR system outdoors. They need to maintain enough heat in this system in order to burn off the exhaust pollution. Important to know that. If I zoom in here, you can see this is an outdoor application. It's important to know it's outdoor. We will design that with flaps over here to make sure that to minimize as much precipitation getting into the insulation. In a removable blanket, we can never really achieve 100% waterproof. But for most systems, if a little bit gets in, it evaporates out, especially in a hot system, or it drips out the bottom. It can be designed for that to make sure that there's no pooling of the water. These are important things for us to know so that we can design appropriately. Again, does it have to look good? Right? If this is an area where, if it's a high-end building and you have customers walking past there, it cannot be an eyesore. Always good to let the provider know that, so they'll take a little bit more attention into what it looks like. Obviously, the more information about the application, the better. It's easier to get it right when we informed about what's required. But later also, does it need to be fire protective? Not all insulation blankets will protect in the case of a fire. I'll show you some more details about that soon. That's another thing we'd need to know. Is it just heat insulation, or is it also fire protection? All important questions to tell us. Furwin does have a fire protective cover. It's been tested to the UL fire testing test, which is the UL 1709. I have a picture of that coming up. We'll show that to you soon. Oh, yeah, it's right here. For that was the next picture. Yeah, so we have a blanket. This test, it looks pretty bad, this blanket, but this is actually during the test. It actually performed extremely well. This is to protect in the case of fires. Often, most commonly used in valve and actuators, where if there's a fire in a plant, they need time before the fire will eventually destroy everything, but they need to turn off the chemicals or dangerous fluids or flammable fluids. They need to close those valves as soon as possible. So they need the insulation to protect them while they shut off all their systems. It looks pretty burnt up, but this outer surface is really just a sacrificial protective layer The insulation was still intact underneath there. But that's important to know if that's the application. Touch temperature, you have to reduce your touch temperature down to safe touch. So over here, we can chart out different types of insulation, different thicknesses, how much is required to bring it down to a safe touch temperature. Safe touch is defined by different standards organization. UL has very specific touch safe temperatures that we can work towards and engineer the blanket to meet that. So the more we can know about your application, obviously the better, and then we can give you what you need, or the vendor, whichever vendor you're working with, they can give you what you need. So that wraps up the technical side. Just a brief overview of an insulation blanket. I hope it's been helpful. Just a little bit about Furwin and the type of.
Before that, Brett, we have a few questions that came in here.
Right. Yeah.
Question here came in: are you able to apply insulation jackets to -40 Fahrenheit valves without the problem of condensation?
That's an excellent question. When we get to the cryogenic temperatures, the blanket definitely has to be engineered to avoid that happening, to get the freezing and getting so they have to be sealed as best as possible. Usually doesn't have to be 100% seal. We've done some applications where we've been successful, but you have to fill in some of the spaces and openings much more effectively than you would have to do with other more ambient or hot temperature applications. So we have worked in cryogenic environments. It's challenging, and special materials have to be used. Some of the regular materials that we would use just would crack at those temperatures and not be effective. So it can be, again, we'd have to know that it's going into that kind of environment, and we can, there are some cases where a blanket cannot be used. You have to have a fully sealed insulation system. It would have to be more of a permanent type insulation, but we have successfully done cryogenic applications where it lended itself to the blanket. So I would say not every application will be doable with a blanket, but many will, but special care and design will have to go into that blanket. Excellent question. Thank you.
Awesome. And then we have another question here from Tom, and he asked, do we use removable blankets on slip type expansion joints?
Yes. One of the advantages of an insulation blanket is its flexibility. Most insulation blankets are flexible. This is a challenge in some hard insulation or permanent insulation applications, where with expansion and contraction, it can actually damage the insulation because they have a very hard outer protective shield cladding. Insulation blankets tend to be very effective on the flex or the expansion joints because they're soft, because they have flexibility in them. They're able to move as the joints contract and expand, but also vibrate. Insulation blankets tend to, for the next time, it's a good point, I'll maybe add it to the presentation. They tend to be very effective at vibration, often more effective than permanent insulation, where because of the stress and strain, permanent insulation has to be designed appropriately to handle the expansion. The soft removable blanket, we've had tremendous success. In fact, many times they'll use it on their flex joint, even though the rest of their system has permanent cladding on it for that reason. I hope I answered your question. Was there anything else, Derek?
All right, so for the a few questions for now. Anybody else have any questions? Feel free to drop it in the chat, and then Brett will address them moving forward.
Okay.
You can just raise your hand, and then I can unmute you, and then we can have your questions answered. I think we can continue, Brett.
Okay, so I'm just basically summarizing and finishing up over here. So if you have questions, please message them to Derek. I'll be more than happy to try and address them. I don't promise I can answer them, but we'll do the best we can. So just to summarize what Furwin is, this little blurb here is a brief overview. And when you're choosing a provider of insulation blankets, it's really like choosing any other kind of provider. You want to know that they have the experience, the expertise, the reliability, and the quality that you need for your product. Furwin, just to give a bit of a plug for Furwin over here, is we've been in business since 1982. That's the early years of the removable blanket industry. It's almost right at the beginning. Around then, that's when they came up with a lot of the high temperature material technology that made removable blankets practical, some of the silicone coatings and stuff. So we've been in business since 1982. We've kept a good try and keep up with the technology of the time. Importantly, we are ISO 9001. We have a very robust quality system, and we have a lot of high-end customers who require that and have very exacting quality standards, which we try and maintain. We do have a staff of engineers, very highly skilled people who are available to help and solve problems. We're really a problem solver. We try and be cost competitive, but we not necessarily the cheapest guy on the market, simply because we're offering a lot of technical expertise, production capabilities. We have every part that we make, we keep a record of. We can always replace parts very easily, fully digitized electrical systems. We take pride in our on-time delivery, which has been lately, because of COVID, has been very challenging at the best of times with supply chain challenges and labor challenges and all the COVID challenges. But we certainly try to maintain a good on-time delivery. And we quite comfortable working with companies from international OEMs all the way down to the small shop guy and the small, smaller customers. We're very comfortable with both extremes, and we do high volume as well as one-offs. So we have that ability to do a custom solution for a particular one-time challenge, but we also have ongoing OEM production runs. This picture over here is actually doing some quality inspection on a high volume production run. And that's a little bit about Furwin. We hope hope you find this helpful and informative. I try to keep it kind of broad and general without getting too technical. Certainly, if you ever need expertise or technical help, we'd love to have the opportunity to see if we can help you. And feel free to give us a call or contact us at any time, and we'll see what we can, if we can help you with your particular challenges. So thank you for attending. We appreciate it. I'm going to hand you back to Derek, who will kind of wrap up and just give you some information about how to get recordings and contact us and so on. So thank you for coming, and we appreciate your time.
Awesome. Thank you again, Brett, for your presentation. So guys, we have 10 minutes for Q&A here. So I know, James, you had a question. Let me unmute you. And then while I'm doing this, Brett, do you have a slide on how people can best get in touch with you if they want to know more?
Yeah. Oh, there we go. Here's a slide.
I just unmuted you, James.
This
Go
would
ahead.
be our main center in Toronto, the contact number for that. Here's the email for inquiries at Furwin. A lot of information on our website. We put quite a bit of effort into making our website very informative. A lot of questions, a lot of technical information is available there. But that doesn't mean you can't contact us directly, but it's a good resource as well. So you can jot this down, and certainly feel free to contact us.
So feel free to send an email to info@furwin.
Info@furwin. It's furwin@furwin.com.
Furwin@furwin.com.
Yeah.
I also, did you, James? Go ahead. You still wanted, if you still had your question, I also saw your chat message here, and we can certainly reach out to you.
Can you hear me?
I can hear
Yeah,
you,
we
yes.
Okay, I think I have enough questions that it'd probably be better to talk with somebody, because we definitely are interested in your product. We've used it on a few of the units, but we have a lot that we need to cover. So if somebody can send me an email, I was on this link here, so the contact would be great. I'm from upstate New York.
Ah, great.
Awesome.
Okay. Well, thank you. Yeah, please contact us. We'd like to see what we can do to help you.
Okay.
We'll send you an email, James, and then we can set that up.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Any other questions, guys? Please feel free to either raise your hand or drop them in the chat. We have a few more minutes here before we wrap things up, but yeah, feel free to let us know if you have any other questions. All right, so it seems like there might not be. If anybody is also interested in getting the presentation, we'll be sending those out, the recording, as soon as it's rendered on our end. And again, any additional questions you have, you can direct them straight to the Furwin team, furwin@furwin.com. We'll also be sending out those emails, so feel free to respond to us via email. If there's nothing else, then again, thank you so much, everybody, for joining the presentation today. I hope you've had learned a little bit more about the industry. And then again, if you have any additional questions, queries, feel free to reach out, and then we can certainly assist you moving forward. So thanks again. And with that being said, have a beautiful rest of your Friday, and we'll hope to talk to you guys soon.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.